So the government completely changed its mind from saying this medicine is not a medicine, it's of no value in summer 18 to yes, it is a medicine and we're going to make it legal in November 18.
I'm Danny Brody, CEO of Elements of Green, and I'm here with Professor Barnes for a little interview. So Professor Barnes, thank you for spending some time with us today. We're really glad to have you. And
it's a pleasure.
I'll let you introduce yourself, but I mean, you're probably one of the most preeminent doctors and professors in the entire cannabis industry for, I'd say, all of Europe. So maybe why don't we just start with that? I mean, you're a consultant neurologist and medical cannabis expert. So yeah, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and what got you interested in the cannabis industry?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for asking me. As you say, I'm a consultant neurologist and a physiatrist, I think you call it in North America, a rehabilitation physician. And I live up in Newcastle upon Tyne, north part of England, and I've been locked down there now for about 4 months. So forgive my slightly relaxed look and longer hair and everything else, but it's common for the world. So cannabis, I was running multiple sclerosis clinics in Newcastle about 20 years ago now, a long time. And some of those guys were coming in saying, well, I'm using cannabis on the black market, of course, it was illegal, well illegal then, and hence helping my pain and my muscle spasticity, and sometimes bladder problems as well. And so just very informally, I asked everyone coming to the clinic, have you used it? And I was very surprised that about 50% of that MS clinic were using cannabis. So I thought there must be something to this. I never really thought about it from a medical point of view before that. Then by chance, I was asked by GW Pharma, which is one of the big early cannabis innovators in the pharmaceutical industry, to get involved with the development of Sativex. Sativex is still available, as I'm sure you guys know, in the UK for management of spasticity and multiple sclerosis. And I was worked with them, and I was the so-called independent expert that signed off their dossier to get it licensed.
Right.
Got me more knowledgeable about cannabis, particularly that variety, that medicine. Then in the UK, nothing much happened for probably 10 years, because we have a body in the UK called NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, which said that Sativex wasn't cost effective and couldn't be used in our health service. So nothing much happened. Then about 4 years ago, I was asked by a government body called the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Drug Policy Reform to just review cannabis for all that, not just neurology, but the whole of the efficacy of cannabis, the safety, the side effects, and everything. And I wrote that dossier with my daughter, who's a clinical psychologist. That was published in September 16. And then I found myself in a position that, like some people do, you suddenly write something, I'm the only person to have written it, and all of a sudden you become the expert because no one else has written anything. So largely true. I became a sort of national sort of expert of the subject, and as a result of that, I got involved with helping a little child called Alfie Dingley, who was now 8 years old. He was 6 at the time, with a very rare pediatric syndrome with very severe and resistant epilepsy. And his parents had taken him to Holland, and his epilepsy had effectively stopped in Holland from having hundreds of seizures a month to no seizures a month. Wow. And his very capable lady called Hannah Deacon started a campaign so she could move back from Holland into the UK, because they couldn't do that at the time. It was illegal in the UK. And that was a very successful media campaign. And as a result of that, eventually, Alfie got a license in summer 18, and I was the first prescriber. And then as a result of that, in turn, the UK changed its scheduling and made cannabis legal for medical purposes in November 18. So in a squash down, that's what's happened. That's my cannabis history up to November 18, at least.
That's incredible. So you've pretty much been responsible for enacting and helping pass the law for the entire medical cannabis market in the UK.
Partly, I wouldn't take full credit for that. I think most of it was the media campaign organized by Hannah Deacon, to be honest. Yeah. was the doctor associated with it who made all the applications to the Home Office for the licensing and everything else. But it was a very successful, extraordinarily successful media campaign. It shows the power of the media actually so the government completely changed its mind from saying this medicine is not a medicine, it's of no value in summer 18 to yes, it is a medicine and we're going to make it legal in November 18, purely as a result of a media campaign.
It switched the mindset of almost everybody in the UK, just like that, having that really public story with that young girl that just really started recovering rapidly by using cannabis from epilepsy, right?
Yeah,
Sounds very similar to Charlotte Figge in the States and her story.
Yeah, it's a very parallel story to Charlotte Figge. That's absolutely right. Yes, yes.
So tell me more about your involvement with GW Pharma and Sativex. So how did that go, and what was sort of your involvement there?
Oh, there it was. I didn't do much of the original studies because what the process was in the UK at the time, that the company making an application for a license for any pharmaceutical product prepares a massive dossier. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of pages, and presents that to what is now called the MHRA, the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Authority. It was called something different then, but that doesn't really matter. What they have to do is to get an independent expert to review the dossier and say that in their independent opinion, this product is worth licensing. It will fulfill a valuable role in the National Health Service in the UK. So my role was as an independent expert, and I therefore did look through the dossier, talk with GW Pharma, and then go and talk to the MHRA. And then it's not my decision, but it was the MHRA that had a committee that decided, but they depended a bit on the opinion from the independent expert. So that was my role. I've never worked for GW. They're good people. There's no criticism there. But I'm not involved with them now.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, I mean, it sounds like you've either way been pretty instrumental with all these different things with cannabis and paving the way for a lot of other people. So it's pretty awesome to see. So I have one question. I mean, there's been a lot of talk recently about cannabis being psychoactive and CBD being specifically non-psychoactive. Do you have a take on it being non-psychoactive versus psychoactive? And how does the word non-intoxicating play a role into all that? Maybe just describe that kind of balance for us.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of debate on words. I think CBD is psychoactive if you define psychoactivity as having an effect on the brain. And clearly CBD does. It's a very good medicine. It affects pain, which is brain mediated. It affects anxiety, which is clearly brain mediated. If you like, if you interpret it that way, CBD is psychoactive, as is THC. I think as you've just said, I think a better term is non-intoxicating. Well, a sort of more accurate term is it doesn't get you high. Right. But in some slightly more scientific language, CBD doesn't get you high. It's non-intoxicating, whereas THC, in certain circumstances, at higher doses can be intoxicating. I think psychoactivity is actually the wrong terminology.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree because it's you kind of associate the intoxicating effect with a high. So to have a product or a compound like CBD being treated as psychoactive might not make a whole lot of sense, but it does affect, like you say, the brain in so many different ways. So it only makes sense that it technically would be, but it's more non-intoxicating, which I think you're right. It's probably a better term. So what about when you were prescribing more? I mean, what did you find worked best? Was it CBD only? Was it THC only? Was it a mix of both? What's sort of
I think, well, cannabis, as you know, is a very personalized medicine. It's a very whole family of medicines. So I don't think there's one answer to that. It depends mainly what condition. Take the children with epilepsy, then a high CBD product is really what they depend on. So we'd always start with CBD. I always prefer full spectrum extracts. I think there's reasonable evidence now, not definite, but reasonable evidence they work better than the isolates. Epidiolex is not quite an isolate, but it's nearly an isolate, if that makes sense. And I think there's some evidence that the full spectrum products work a little bit better in terms of more children to help with more reduction of seizures. So we'd start with a high CBD product. Then for the children, we might, some seem to respond to adding just a little bit of THC into that mix, and we're talking only perhaps 4, 5, maybe up to 10 milligrams of THC.
Right.
Excuse me. But then if you're looking at an adult with pain, you're looking at a different scenario. Again, personally, I would start with a CBD product. It does have some analgesic effect, some pain relieving effect. I don't think it's anything like as efficacious as THC, but we'd start with CBD because you can sometimes get benefit from sleep or anxiety, which can be all mixed in with a pain syndrome. And that's safer, and that adds in, then add in THC. And of course, if it's CBD, then you don't get so much of the intoxicating effects of the THC.
Yeah, exactly.
For example, you have to build up sometimes the THC to quite high levels. So as a generalization, I would always start pretty well everybody on a high CBD product, and then as need be, add in THC as we go along.
Nice. Yeah, and I mean, I of course I saw the 169-page study that you published in 2016, and I mean I haven't read all of it, but I did read a bunch of it, just kind of doing my research for the interview. And one of the interesting things you talked about was exactly that, was the entourage effect, and how, I mean, you've talked about the CBD to THC ratio, and how it appears to be quite important. So I mean, maybe just I know people have beaten probably to death the entourage effect, but I feel like this interview is going to be seen by a lot of first-time consumers that are just coming to our site for the first time. So could you maybe just give us a quick overview of the entourage effect and how it relates to a CBD isolate?
Yeah, well, the entourage effect, I think it's pretty real. I mean, some cynics would say it's not yet a proven concept. I think there's enough evidence to say that it almost certainly is. And basically that means that the cannabis plant, the cannabinoids and the terpenes and other components of the cannabis plant work together to have a greater effect than the individual components. So if we take CBD, CBD is fine. In isolation, a CBD isolate does work. It's the same chemical. It works for anxiety, it works for pain, it certainly works for epilepsy. There's nothing wrong with it at all. And it's perhaps easier to get to market because you could treat it as a pharmaceutical product. It's a single entity pharmaceutical product. It can go through the standard pharmaceutical promotion of double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, etc., etc. Nothing wrong with it. But I think the evidence is emerging that if you use even a high CBD product, but you take a full spectrum of the rest of the plant, in other words, it may have predominantly CBD, but it will have a little bit of the other cannabinoids like CBG or CBC, a little bit maybe of THC, depending on the legalities of the area you're working in. And it will also have particularly terpenes like myrcene or linalool or whatever the other terpenes are. So the whole mix of the plant has a better effect for childhood epilepsy, for example, than CBD isolate. Put that in numbers, the numbers from Epidiolex, the CBD isolate, which isn't quite, but nearly, is about 43% of children with drug-resistant epilepsy improve their seizures by at least 50%. Now that's great because these are children who have not responded to anything very much. But if they go from Epidiolex to a full spectrum product, then probably you can get that number up to about 70–75% of children respond by at least 50% reduction in their seizures. Wow. And probably the dose you need is less, definitely, and therefore the side effects tend to be less and more easily tolerated.
Well, that's a good point. So you can actually give them less dose of a full spectrum
dose with a greater effect. Wow. And the same things with pain. It's been shown that the combination of cannabinoids have a better pain-killing effect than individual components. So there's several studies now that show that the whole plant is better than the individual component, and that's called the entourage effect.
Fair enough. I love hearing that because I've had personal experiences myself where I'd have maybe 100 milligram capsule of isolate, and it does it does about the same as a 10 milligram serving size of a full spectrum product for me. So
I mean the dose of Epidiolex again is maybe 1,000–1,500 milligrams. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you use the full spectrum product, the children are looking at 300–400 milligrams. So it's very roughly a third of the dose.
Wow, that's incredible.
Great effect.
I love it. It's so neat, the science behind all of this, which I mean leads me into my next question. So Coming from neurology, you obviously understand the human brain better than probably 99.9% of the rest of the human population.
I don't think any of us understand the human brain that well.
Fair enough. But maybe just talk to us a little bit about how cannabis kind of interacts with the body, how CBD interacts with the brain, and how it kind of ties together with the endocannabinoid system.
Yeah, well, as probably know, I mean, cannabis, the plant cannabis really interacts with the body largely, but not totally, through the endocannabinoid system. If people don't know, the endocannabinoid system is what's called a neurotransmitter system. So the whole body works by nerves interacting with other nerves. And when one nerve comes to an end, it joins another nerve, and at that gap, chemicals jump over that gap, and the electrical signal will carry on by chemicals jumping across the gap between the nerves. The different chemicals subserve different functions, and there's 8 or 10 different chemicals that do that, and they're called neurotransmitters. And people will have heard probably of dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter that goes haywire for cause Parkinson's disease, for example. Serotonin is another one that has a role in the management of depression. So there's a lot of these neurotransmitter systems. Those transmitter systems are overall controlled by an overarching system called the endocannabinoid system. That's, if you like, the master controller of all those other neurotransmitter systems. It's the thing that modulates that conduction between the nerves. It balances the production between nerves. It switches off production. It's like a master controller. If it's overacting, it turns it down. If it's underacting, it turns it up. That sort of thing. That's the endocannabinoid system.
That's incredible.
Every animal has that in their body. Every vertebrate has a natural endocannabinoid system. We produce chemicals in the brain. They're called anandamide and 2-AG are two examples, which act through that system to control and modulate and balance the whole body. All the plant's doing, in fact, is interacting with that endocannabinoid system. The cannabinoids in the plant, called phytocannabinoids from the plant, lock on to the same chemical structures that our own body's endocannabinoids do. So it helps to enhance, or in some cases reduce or modulate or change our own body's endocannabinoid system. And the endocannabinoid system has a huge role. If it controls all the functions in the body, then it's not surprising that cannabis can have such a broad range of effects. Some people say, well, it's some sort of snake oil. It can't help anxiety on one hand and pain on the other, and ADHD on another, and so it can't be right. But it is. When you think about how it works, you can then understand why it has such a broad-ranging effect.
Right.
So that's all it does. It interacts. The plant cannabinoids interact with our own endocannabinoid system.
I love that.
Then you can see why it has such a broad-ranging effect.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, that's such a great way to look at it. And the fact that it kind of sits almost above these neurotransmitters that regulate all these different functions of the body just makes it so abundantly clear why it can actually help with so many different ailments, right? Help treat everything from pain to sleep, even epilepsy. That's pretty incredible. All right, so what's maybe let's shift gears a little bit and talk about kind of the legal landscape here. So we know it's an incredible product. We know it obviously works and helps with all these different types of ailments. But I mean, the fact of the matter is, it's been used for thousands of years, but for whatever reason, it's been made illegal in pretty much the entire world. And now we're just kind of coming out of that illegal framework, right? Now we're coming into the light. We're coming out of the black market. UK passed some incredible legislation in 2018 that made medical cannabis legal, and of course you have a legal CBD framework from CBD produced from hemp, which is of course what we have on our site right now. But what about the recreational market? What do you see happening with the recreational market? Is that going to unfold like the rest of Canada, say, or Uruguay? What do you see happening there?
Yeah. It's difficult to know. I think what's likely to happen is that, first of all, we're not using much medical cannabis in the UK. The law changed in 2018, but so far, as of today, we think there's about 750 people being prescribed it, because the Service, and 90% of our health in the UK, for those that don't know, is through the National Health Service, the public service, and about 10% is private. The National Health Service, for many complicated reasons that we can go through if you like, isn't prescribing it full stop. So it's all through the private sector. The private sector, of course, is expensive. And so there's relatively few people using it in the UK, which is sad. But it is picking up. Our clinics are increasing by about 20% each month now. And the cost of products is coming down. So therefore, numbers of people using it privately are going up. So I think over the next year, we'll see several thousand people in the UK use it. They will go back to their general practitioners, their primary care physicians, their specialists, and hopefully will say, this is helping me, why don't you prescribe it? And then I think over the next year, 18 months, we'll see broader prescribing on the National Health Service. It will come.
Right.
Once it's come, then I think in numbers of several tens of thousands, bearing in mind in the UK, there's about 1.3 million people use cannabis for medical purposes every day.
Wow.
But when more of those are actually using it legally, then I think people will say, well, actually, this is really safe. They know someone who's used it and they've done well on it, and they begin to say, well, is this actually safe? It is propaganda, to be honest. Propaganda about how unsafe it is, how risky it is for mental health issues and psychosis. It's perhaps not such a risk as we thought it was, and I think then we will begin to see a softening of attitude towards recreational cannabis, which is just about, if it went to a public vote now, it will be very close. There was a poll in London that I think showed 60-odd% of the population in London was pro-recreational cannabis. London is perhaps a little bit more, it's sort of the California of the UK. I think there's more conservative areas in the UK, and maybe the vote will be 45-50%.
Right.
So very, very fine-tuned. But we see more medical cannabis coming along. I think people say, well, this is not a big deal. And I think then the momentum will build up for recreational cannabis.
Yeah.
No, we're not dealing with it at all. It's out of the question. I think maybe we'll have to see a change of government to a slightly more left-wing related government to actually make that happen. Whether it happens, I don't know. I think if it is, I think it's likely to happen over the next 3 or 4 years, personally.
Fair enough, and that's what we saw in Canada as well, right? From 2013, we had the medical framework come in with the new MMPR system, where you could allow licensed cannabis producers to grow cannabis, sell it to medical patients. That shifted really everything. But I mean, we've had medical cannabis in Canada since 2001. But it's sort of following the same framework. I mean, we saw it come in a large scale in 2013 and move forward to 2016 when the federal government announced the recreational landscape, and then took a couple years to bring it in. But now Canada's the first G20 nation to legalize it. It's
creeping into parts of Europe now. I mean, Switzerland have been last week, I think it was, said they were going to do a trial of recreational cannabis in Switzerland. It's also in Luxembourg. Okay, that's a small country, clearly, but it only takes a few European countries to do that, and then the whole lot will tip over, because Europe is such relatively open borders. You're not going to sustain a legal recreational market in one country and not the none next door. So, I think those barriers are breaking down.
Yeah, exactly. And it's nice to see with the EU as a whole have most countries in the EU have the 0.2% THC in your CBD product. Maybe for some of our newer listeners and customers, can we just talk about that for a second, and how that kind of relates, and if there's any outliers like France or Norway or Sweden to that rule?
Yeah, it's I couldn't go country by country, but generally speaking, hemp is legal in virtually all Europe, certainly the western part of Europe. Generally speaking, the percentage, as you've just said, is about 0.2. Actually, there's a bit of confusion about that. There's EU certified seeds, about 28 of them. If you plant those seeds, they should produce a plant that produces less than 0.2% by dry weight of THC. That's the definition. It's not actually in the 0.2% of the final product. We have a slightly bizarre regulation in the UK that the container in which you sell the CBD has to contain less than 1 milligram of THC, which, if you think about it, is totally logical, because it depends on the size of the container. You can have a small container or a massive great container. It doesn't matter. It's the size. The container must contain less than 1 milligram of THC, which is completely crazy. Totally ridiculous. So there's all sorts of weird laws that are unhelpful, like it cannot make any medical claims for it. So you've got people, many, probably hundreds of thousands of people using CBD in the UK, let alone Europe, for medical conditions, who are buying it off the shelf in health food shops, but they don't know what to do with it because no one can tell them, because they can't make any medical claims. So something's got to happen with that. It's a very unsatisfactory.
Education plays such an important role.
Yeah, it's crazy. CBD is a medicine. Let's not deny that any longer. And what we need to do is have I accept the fact that you can't have a product that's sold as a medicine when it's not gone through a medical approval process. But what we need to do is look at the botanical plant slightly differently from a pharmaceutical product. And what I'd love to see across Europe, but particularly UK, is something like an office of medicinal cannabis set up, so they can look at a botanical product sensibly, look at the evidence for its usefulness, not from double-blind trials like a pharmaceutical product, but from observational studies. They can look at the licensing, they can look at the importation regulations, they can look at the marketing requirements, they can put education programs. There's a lot that an office of medicinal cannabis, for want of a better word, can do that's just being done in bits and pieces, jigsaw, piecemeal, whatever you call it, in different countries in Europe. So, Germany is different from France, is different from Spain. It's a mess at the moment. It needs sorting out.
Fair enough. And then you've got some certain countries like France that have 0.0% THC requirements.
Yeah.
I know in the UK you can't actually buy CBD pet products unless it's prescribed by a.
Exactly, yeah. Pet products are illegal in the UK. Then you have things like the Channel Islands, UK, which are not strictly speaking part of the UK, but they're called a crown dependency. They have regulations. They have higher THC allowed in the product. So even within the broader UK, we've got differences of legality. It's
I can't wait till we just have one kind of overarching rule for every European country that just ties it all together, whether it's 0.2%.
Exactly. It'll make your life much easier. Yeah.
Whatever it might be, but it's for right now, it's a fairly complicated system, but on our side, at least, we've got a whole education center dedicated just to the legalities of CBD. So we, again, we really try to help people understand what is and what isn't legal. Okay, we're coming up on, I don't want to go too long here. So, I mean, any final comments for the listeners, or any final comments you'd like to bring across?
I think the only other thing that I think has gone wrong in the UK is we've done some things right in the UK. We've allowed it for any condition, so we haven't restricted it to pain or epilepsy. It's any condition. That's good. I think the mistake we made, well, two mistakes. One is it can only be prescribed by a specialist doctor, that's a hospital consultant, and not a general practitioner, primary care physician. I think that's a mistake, because I think cannabis is a very good primary care medicine for mild anxiety or milder end of the pain spectrum, etc. I think that was a mistake. And I think the government also made a mistake that it's really been quite difficult about allowing UK industry, giving high THC cultivation licenses so we get a UK industry, and we're less dependent on importation. And the COVID has brought to the fore the fact that relying on an external imported supply chain causes all sorts of problems. And I'd like to see, nothing wrong with those products, but I'd love to see UK industry get off the ground as well. And after COVID, with all the need to stimulate the economy and everything else, I think that would be lovely to see.
Yeah, well, we've seen it here in Canada. I mean, the amount of tax revenue the Canadian government's starting to make now from legalization and having everybody produce the products within the country, I mean, it adds to our GDP, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Perfect. All right, well, Professor Barnes, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate all your insight and all your help for us.
Fine, a pleasure.